From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We are facing a massacre, or even a war of genocide. This is unprecedented, even in conventional wars.
A massacre in Cairo. At least 525 people have been killed as Egyptian security forces crack down on two protest camps filled with supporters of ousted President Mohamed Morsi. The Muslim Brotherhood says the actual death toll tops 2,000. The Egyptian military has defended the crackdown and declared a state of emergency.
The government demands the political leadership of the Brotherhood to stop incitements to violence, which threaten national security. The government holds these leaders fully responsible for any blood that is shed and of all acts of riots.
We'll speak with Democracy Now!'s Sharif Abdel-Quddus in Cairo and others on the crisis in Egypt. Then Bradley Manning apologizes to a military judge days before his sentencing. We'll speak with reporter Alexa Bryan, who has been in the courtroom since the beginning. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Egypt's political crisis is growing after the country's deadliest violence since the Egyptian revolution broke out in 2011. At least 525 people were killed and over 3,500 wounded Wednesday in government raids on protest encampments filled with supporters of ousted President Mohamed Morsi in Cairo. Police and troops used bulldozers, tear gas, and live ammunition to clear out the two sit-ins. Makeshift clinics were overrun with the dead and wounded. Members of the Muslim Brotherhood responded by storming and torching police stations. 43 police officers were reportedly killed. 4 journalists also died in Wednesday's violence. Egypt's army-installed government has declared a month-long state of emergency and imposed a dusk-to-dawn curfew on the capital of Cairo and 10 other provinces. The move came shortly after it installed 25 provincial governors, including 19 military generals and 2 loyalists of ousted dictator Hosni Mubarak. Interim Vice President Mohamed al-Baradei, a Nobel Peace Laureate, resigned hours after Wednesday's crackdown began, saying the conflict could have been resolved by peaceful means. The Muslim Brotherhood has called for new rallies in Cairo today. Mohamed el-Beltagi, a senior Muslim Brotherhood leader who lost his daughter in Wednesday's violence, urged supporters to protest Egypt's military.
I swear to God that if people don't keep protesting, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi would just drag this country into more troubles. He would drag this nation into a civil war so he can escape the death penalty. Be aware, Egyptian people. Go onto the streets now to announce the end of the armed forces' political life.
In Washington, D.C., Secretary of State John Kerry condemned the violence, but the Obama administration announced no moves to cut aid to the Egyptian military.
Today's events are deplorable, and they run counter to Egyptian aspirations for peace, inclusion, and genuine democracy. Egyptians inside and outside of the government need to take a step back. They need to calm the situation and avoid further loss of life. We also strongly oppose a return to a state of emergency law. And we call on the government to respect basic human rights, including freedom of peaceful assembly and due process under the law.
We'll have more from Egypt after headlines. Defense attorneys for Army Private Bradley Manning have rested their case at the convicted whistleblower's sentencing hearing. On Wednesday, Manning spoke publicly for the first time in months in a statement apologizing for leaking classified documents to WikiLeaks. Manning said, quote, "I'm sorry for the unintended consequences of my actions. When I made these decisions, I believed I was going to help people, not hurt people." An Army psychologist who analyzed Manning while he served in Iraq also testified on Wednesday, along with a clinical psychologist who spent 21 hours examining Manning after his arrest. Manning's sister and aunt also both took the stand to deliver emotional testimony about his childhood. Manning faces up to 90 years in prison after being convicted last month on 20 counts for leaking troves of secret documents to WikiLeaks. We'll have more on Bradley Manning's sentencing hearing with journalist Alexa O'Brien later in the broadcast. In Iraq, at least 33 people were killed today when a series of car bombs exploded in Baghdad. More than 100 were wounded. State forces in Bahrain have cracked down on pro-democracy rallies challenging the U.S.-backed monarchy. On Wednesday, Bahraini police fired tear gas and birdshot at a number of protests in Shiite villages around the capital, Manama. Bahraini opposition activists say more than 60 rallies were organized across the country. The U.S. Embassy closed down for the day after activists planned to rally outside. The Bahraini monarchy is a key U.S. government ally, hosting the Navy's Fifth Fleet. The United Nations is warning an unstable political environment and a growing humanitarian crisis are pushing the Central African Republic to the brink of collapse. Conditions have worsened in the CAR since Seleka rebels ousted President Francois Bozize 4 months ago. In a briefing to the Security Council, top UN officials warned international support is direly needed.
As there is no proper chain of command, the country runs the risk of descending into anarchy and chaos. Some police officers are reporting to work, but are not equipped to work safely and effectively.
Much more international support is required to meet growing needs. Critical sectors such as water, sanitation and hygiene have received less than 10% of the funding required.
The African Union's peacekeeping force for the Central African Republic has asked the UN for greater assistance to fulfill its mandate. The group Doctors Without Borders has announced dangerous conditions are forcing it to cease operations in Somalia after 22 years. In a statement, the group cited extreme attacks on our staff and an environment that condones, quote, the killing, assaulting and abducting of humanitarian aid workers. The move will mean the loss of health care services for hundreds of thousands of people. The Pentagon's announced it'll start providing benefits to same-sex military families beginning next month. The move comes in response to the Supreme Court decision in June that struck down the Defense of Marriage Act, which barred federal recognition of same-sex marriages. Married same-sex couples in the military and civilian Pentagon employees will be entitled to benefits, including health care, housing costs, and survivor pay. Couples stationed in states that will bar same-sex weddings will be granted leave to get married in states where such unions are legal. The California Supreme Court, meanwhile, has rejected a new effort to halt same-sex marriages in the state. On Wednesday, the court dismissed a bid from supporters of Proposition 8 to ignore the initial federal court order that struck down the ban. The Supreme Court ruled in June Prop 8 supporters don't have legal standing to appeal. New York prosecutors have unveiled charges against 2 former employees of the banking giant J.P. Morgan Chase for the so-called London whale trades that cost the bank more than $6 billion and derailed financial markets worldwide. A Senate probe earlier this year accused J.P. Morgan Chase of misleading the public, manipulating documents, and ignoring warnings from within its own ranks as the losses piled up. On Wednesday, U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara announced the first charges to stem from the case.
The defendants deliberately and repeatedly lied about the fair value of billions of dollars in assets on J.P. Morgan's books in order to cover up massive losses that mounted month after month at the beginning of 2012. Those lies misled investors, regulators, and the public, and they constituted federal crimes. As has already been conceded, this was not a tempest in a teapot, but rather a perfect storm of individual misconduct and inadequate internal controls.
The 2 defendants reside in Europe, and it's unclear if they'll face extradition. The White House is backing off initial reports that Director of National Intelligence James Clapper will head a government review of NSA spying. President Obama announced an independent review of the NSA's operations on Friday, but then suggested Clapper would be in charge. Clapper's name immediately sparked outrage following accusations he lied to Congress about NSA surveillance earlier this year. A National Security Council spokesperson now says the White House, not Clapper, will choose the review panel's members. The military contractor Khaki International is seeking legal costs from 4 Iraqi prisoners who unsuccessfully sued the company for their torture at Abu Ghraib. One of the plaintiffs, an Iraqi farmer, alleges he was caged, beaten, threatened with dogs, and given electric shocks during more than 4 years in U.S. detention. But a federal judge dismissed the case in June, citing the recent Supreme Court decision to restrict lawsuits under the Alien Tort Statute against corporations for abuses on foreign soil. Based on that ruling, the website Common Dreams reports that Kaki has now filed a lawsuit demanding the 4 Iraqis hand over $15,000 to cover the firm's legal fees. The top prosecutor in Orlando, Florida, says he plans to review the FBI's fatal shooting of the unarmed Chechen man questioned for his ties to the Boston Marathon bombers in May. Agents were questioning Ibrahim Tadashev at his Orlando apartment when he allegedly tried to attack them. After multiple anonymous claims that Tadashev was armed, it later emerged the circumstances were unclear. State Attorney Jeff Ashton says he now received a preliminary Justice Department report on the shooting. Speaking during a visit to Florida, Tadashev's father said he wants justice for his son.
Один отец не испытали в жизни то, что испытываю я и мать Ибрагима.
I hope and pray that no mother and no father will ever have to endure and go through what I'm going through right now.
Мой сын очень хорошим мальчиком был. Он невиновен. Его просто убили.
My son was a very good boy and he is innocent and he was simply killed.
The Tadashev family is considering a civil action against the FBI. A recent expose by the New York Times found the FBI has cleared its agents in every single shooting incident dating back 2 decades. And former Democratic Congressmember Jesse Jackson, Jr. of Illinois has been sentenced to 30 months in prison after pleading guilty to corruption charges earlier this year. Former Congressmember Jackson spent more than $750,000 in campaign funds on personal items, including music memorabilia and items for his home. He resigned last year after a several-month leave to seek treatment for bipolar disorder. His wife, Sandy, was also sentenced to 12 months for tax fraud. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.